Britain's social housing landscape is changing. High-rise tower blocks built on the utopian ideals of the post-war period are coming down. They have, in some eyes, come to represent the failures of social housing.
These are not very sustainable buildings. If you count the cost in the longer term, how long will these buildings be fit for purpose?
High-rise housing is emblematic of like I said, the quote-unquote failures of social housing and of the welfare state.
With new alternatives already here.
They're beautiful to live in. They cost a fraction of the cost of a normal house would to heat, and it's a community.
Is it the end of the road for high-rise housing? During the first half of the 20th century, much of Britain's slum housing was cleared to make way for modern estates. Architects and planners saw slum clearance as an opportunity to enact a modern urban future. High-rise estates with streets in the sky. Britain's first residential tower block was completed in 1951. A radical departure from what had gone before, it was awarded a Ministry of Health Housing Medal.
She has a modern kitchen adjoining a big lounge.
Living high became synonymous with fresh air, light and modern appliances. Large estates such as the Aylesbury in Southwark were constructed, clearing away areas of terraced housing. But by the time the Aylesbury was completed in 1977, the cracks in Britain's commitment to a high-rise future were beginning to show. The Ronan Point disaster began to shake the faith in tower blocks, and some started to question the utopian ideals of this style of living. Margaret Thatcher's election in 1979 saw the introduction of right to buy, transforming the social housing system. High-rise in particular was up for question.
I don't think we could honestly say we did get housing right last time we were in government.
Thatcher's policies coincided with urban geographer Alice Coleman's claims that the design of these estates caused the social problems existing within them. This added weight to the idea that design was a core component to many social issues. The debate about the desirability of high-rise living continues to this day, with many earmarked for demolition or regeneration. There seems to be no real desire to rebuild estates like this one behind me. So, what's driving this trend? Some point to years of stigmatisation.
Politically, there is gradually being, certainly under the Conservative coalition and government of the last 10 to 15 years, a policy of almost stigmatising social housing. And within that is lumped high-rise housing and large estates that were built in the 50s and the 60s. Some people have said they're now unpopular, but actually, if you again look at the attempts to regenerate them estates, lots of people who live on those estates would say, if you regenerated this estate properly, if you maintained it properly, if you managed it properly, we would be quite happy to continue to live on this estate.
After the release of a 2016 Savills report called Creating London's Streets, David Cameron vowed to blitz poverty by demolishing large housing estates. Cameron wrote, "There were warm and welcoming homes to be found on those estates, but step outside and you're confronted by concrete slabs dropped from on high, brutal high-rise towers and dark alleyways that are a gift to criminals and drug dealers." This perception extends more generally to popular culture. We've all seen how these estates have been portrayed on our televisions, breeding grounds for crime and antisocial behaviour. Rob Clayton is a photographer hoping to revive the image of social housing.
I do find myself fighting like the argument that, hey, hold on a minute, these places to live are actually a mixed bag. And some people, in fact, a hell of a lot of people, have had amazingly successful, happy lives. And you need to understand that in the course of post-war history, over the last 50 years, the perception of people who've lived and grown up is very different to people who view them from afar.
Right or wrong, this perception may have impacted how the public view housing. A 2018 poll found that 25% of respondents support high-rise development in urban areas. In contrast, 70% supported traditional two-storey properties built on new streets. To understand how residents see their own estates, I've come to the Aylesbury in South London. Due to be fully demolished by 2036, many residents here have spent years fighting attempts to evict them. One of those at the forefront of this campaign is Victoria.
These councillors, they are not working for us. We elect them for them to work for us, but they don't do that. What they are doing is they are working with the council in order for us to move out. He came and he told me, "Oh, these flats are cracking. You have to be demolished. It's the end of the life." I said, "Look, come in." I told him, "Come in and see, look my flat. You want to take my home? This is my flat. You want to take this one? If you have a property, somebody can say you have to move. How do you feel put in my position?"
Victoria represents a divide between rhetoric and reality on the ground. Still, organisations like Create Streets and the Policy Exchange say low-rise housing is linked to better public health outcomes. Many in the architectural community back this view.
If you live on a street, you have ownership of your front garden. Even if you don't have ownership of it, you have a sense that it is belonging to you because it's outside your front door, and people tend to look after spaces better when they have a sense of ownership rather than it being shared by too many people. When you get into very big buildings, people don't feel any ownership. If something is a broken window or it's not repaired, they don't feel it's their responsibility, and they might find the common areas of the building very inhospitable because it's shared with too many people, and you don't know what strangers are hanging around, and it becomes a forbidding kind of place, particularly for women, children, people who are elderly, people with disabilities. The common areas can become quite off-putting places and places they don't want to spend time, compared to a street that's active and that feels safer.
But not all architects agree. Carl Sharrow believes there is a place for high-rise.
Essentially, the more low-rise developments require more land. It requires bigger, contiguous pieces of free land, right? And it's going to be invariably developed at a lower density, which means you're going to deliver fewer units per acre than you would somewhere else, right? That doesn't work everywhere. Some of the sites that we work on in central London are kind of so challenged that you can't get any kind of economic feasibility out of developing something so low rise unless you actually want to subsidize it. So these can work in certain locations, but as I come back to it, when we look at more central locations where more and more people want to live, that's not the solution.
I visited the Beacontree estate in Dagenham, often held up as an example of the success of low-rise social housing. Completed in 1935, it is Europe's largest housing estate and recently celebrated its centenary anniversary. So why do its residents think it is celebrated as a successful housing model?
I don't think I could bear to live in a high-rise area. I really don't. We can breathe around here. Although it's quite built up, traffic has certainly built up over time. It feels quite a clean space. There's air. We've got a lot of open spaces built into the area that makes a lot of difference. I can always find somewhere to go for a walk, getting a bit of green space, which is good.
Beacontree may now be held up as a success, but it hasn't always been this way. Perceptions can change over time.
In terms of Beacontree, in terms of all those other large or not so large cottage suburbs, they generally seen as having been more successful. But I'll also point to the fact that these are transient perceptions. Also, Beacontree, of course, was hugely criticised at the time for its kind of monolithic uniformity, its lack of character, lack of facilities, and so on. Those kind of criticisms have been made of pretty much every other cottage suburb over the years. So I guess part of what I try and do in the book is say that all these judgments are provisional.
These cycles of perception have over the years been influenced by disasters such as the Grenfell fire in 2017. The catastrophe sparked a debate around the safety and desirability of tower blocks.
Probably one of the biggest social housing catastrophes and disasters in the 21st century. And that's raised a number of questions, again, about the suitability of high-rise housing, not just in terms of what families live in high-rise, but actually the safety of the blocks themselves. And more recently, lots of people have been worried because lots more high-rise housing has that sort of cladding that caught fire at Grenville. So I think there's a whole range of issues that have come together that have made high-rise housing more unpopular.
The pandemic has also impacted this conversation, redefining what is considered adequate social housing.
I think that what COVID's going to do is it's going to make people think again carefully about how space is provided within and without houses. Because if we want people to work from home, for example, we're going to have to think differently about what space we provide them with. I think one of the interesting things will be whether high-rise housing could make a comeback in a sort of a cyclical sense once we're kind of free of the stigma of this generation.
In Norwich, evidence may have emerged of a low-rise future for social housing. The Goldsmith Street development, completed in 2019, has won a Sterling Prize, which emphasised its low-rise design, wide streets and individual garden plots. Kai was one of the first residents to move into the development and told us his thoughts.
It's affordable and quality, and not only that, it's really eco-friendly in terms of utilities and especially gas, because they're all eco builds as well, and I think that's just the way that the world's moving forwards.
Clive Lewis, the MP for the constituency, believes the estate offers a template for future developments.
The reason I think this is probably better than high-rise is because one of the things the pandemic has shown us, and I might not have said this before the pandemic, but one of the things that the pandemic showed us is the importance of green spaces. You can see that in the situation on house prices. If you have a garden, you know, your house price is worth maybe 10, 15, 20% more now than it was before the pandemic, because people appreciate that this may not be the last pandemic that we have, the last lockdown that we have, and that having access to those green spaces for yourself, for your family is really important. And I think with high-rise blocks, that's obviously, you know, unless you're on the ground floor, you're away, you can't have a garden. And I think that's a problem. And I think that, for me, is partly why these are so successful. You've got green space over there, you've got green space here. It's full of green spaces and people have access to it as well as what's in their back garden. And I think that increasingly is going to be of increasing importance, and high-rise is, you know, can't have that.
If low-rise social housing has come to be seen as the future, are we in essence seeing the demise of the high-rise block? High-rise social housing has faced a number of attacks, political, economic and within our popular culture. Along with recent events such as Grenfell and COVID-19, increasing numbers of people are seeing estates like this one as the future. This low-rise, low-density housing takes us a long way from the 1960s vision of high-rise.
It comes from, ultimately, I think it comes from this notion that we as human beings shouldn't try anything new, right? It's like the kind of the sense that some people want to come up with these days is anything we try that's different from traditional ways of doing things is vanity and is going to fail.
It's sort of like a dichotomy between like this political idea and maybe social idea that this is a less desirable place to live, and yet there's an enormous waiting list of desire to be fulfilled.
I lost the whole thing now. It's nothing to fight, because the council now have the power to evict us any moment.
The reputation is such that for the next 20 years or so, people who are building new estates, whether it's social housing estates, whether it's private estates, whether it's a mix of estates, are going to be building low-rise.
We're at a turning point for social housing in Britain, with a housing crisis to match that of the post-war period, along with the pandemic. We have an opportunity to rethink the way we house Britons. Yet these crises seem to have created one certainty: the utopian vision of living high in the sky is over.